Hello everybody and welcome to Flock Talk. I figured I would talk a little bit today about the things that I considered when choosing Toto to be the bird to join the flock over any other rescue bird that was available. As much as I wish I could say it's just because he's cute so I brought him home, there were a lot of things that needed to be considered when choosing a bird to bring into a house that already has an established bird in it. So initially, my main goal when looking for a new bird to bring into this household was one that is going to get along with Newt. Now, with that being said, there is never a guarantee that two birds are going to get along, even when you do everything in your power to pick ones that should be compatible. Birds have very individual personalities, and even super social birds can just decide not to get along with a certain bird. And we always need to be prepared for that potential option. And whether that means having a plan B for housing the bird completely separately, or having someone on standby that's capable of taking care of the birds so they don't have to go back into a shelter system. We just always want to make sure that we are prepared for the worst case scenario. Can you go to my shoulder? Yeah, thank you. So when it came to picking a bird that was going to hopefully be a successful companion for Newt, I was actually originally looking for conures. And the main reason for this being that they'll have very similar play styles, they'll have very similar body language and behaviors and mannerisms that will help them be able to communicate clearly right out the gate and not have nearly as many problems. When it comes to mixing two different species, like a Quaker and a conure, there are minute differences between their body language and behaviors that can be misinterpreted by each bird, which would then make collaborating quite a bit more difficult for them. Now obviously, if my main goal was to find a conure, a green-cheeked conure or a maroon belly, something very similar in the realm of Newt's species, I wouldn't have ended up with Toto, right? He's not a conure and they do have very different behaviors. And there's a distinct reason why I didn't end up choosing the number of conures that were available. And the biggest one is the reason why they were being rehomed. Now, although I am perfectly capable of training most behaviors, and although I totally could have picked just about any bird and probably been able to make it work, I wanted the highest chance of success. At the point in time, At the point in time of me trying to find a bird that's going to collaborate with Newt, my main priority was Newt's mental well-being. He had just lost Mia, he was struggling, he started over-preening his feathers. He is having a hard time being alone. So I need to find a bird that's not only going to potentially get along with him, but potentially be able to do so pretty quickly. The longer that I leave it and the more I have to work on resolving behavior problems, I'm now putting potentially years of work before they're even able to potentially interact. So I have to try and find a bird that doesn't already have a lot of predisposed behavioral problems that I'm going to have to take a lot of time to fix before being able to introduce the two birds together, since my priority was helping Newt's mental health. And just about every single listing for a small conure in my area was because the birds were aggressive. The birds were being rehomed for bullying other birds or for bullying other people in the home. So that pretty quickly ended up making them all not viable options for what I was looking for. In Toto's case, he was only being rehomed because the people didn't have time for him anymore. He wasn't being rehomed because of massive behavioral problems. He wasn't being rehomed for being aggressive to other birds in his cage. He was just being rehomed because people who were taking care of him realized that they couldn't do it anymore. He was just too much. And so he had a much better starting point from a behavioral perspective. Since he doesn't have any predisposed major behavioral problems, there's not going to be a huge amount of time that I now have to set aside to help make Toto a potential prospect for interacting with Newt in the long run. Gooey gooey. Another point leaning in Toto's direction was that he had already been living with a pineapple green-cheeked conure. And although a green-cheek is a slightly different species than a maroon belly that Newt is, that means that Toto has experience living and interacting with a conure. There were ample photos of him on his listing socially interacting with his bird, preening them, and getting along quite well. So that tells me that Toto already has a really strong history of interacting in a positive manner with a bird with very similar mannerisms to Newt, which sets him up to be a very potential good companion when it comes to them actually being able to interact. If Toto already has background information on how Newt is going to move and interact and how his body language is going to communicate, that means Toto is going to be way better at being able to understand Newt's body language, respect his space, and for Toto to be a much more confident bird when meeting them for the first time. Next on the things to consider is the general species behaviors and mannerisms. What in the wild does this bird tend to do? Do they tend to socially interact with other birds? Do they tend to pair off and bond with their mate and then hate everything else around them? Or are they a pretty neutral, kind of stable bird? And how are the general species characteristics in captivity as well? Good bird, good job. Now there were a few other potential options when it came to selecting a bird to potentially be Newt's companion, one of which was a Senegal, which would have fit the general safe size category. When you're trying to find a bird that's going to go together, you want to make sure that if something does go wrong and they end up fighting, both birds are going to have a pretty equal chance, and it's not going to cause instant, immediate, super damaging harm if you happen to look away for half a second. You want to make sure they're a relatively safe size ratio. So that cut out a lot of size options. There were a lot of Indian ringnecks being rehomed. There were a lot of African greys and cockatoos and things like that. Those birds are way too big to safely be able to interact with Newt if something were to go wrong. Toto, on the other hand, is a little bit bigger than Newt by about half an inch. They're relatively the same size. If something were to go super horribly wrong, it would be a pretty equal fight, and one bird is not going to immediately outpower the other and have super dramatic things go wrong in an instant. So one of the next ones we had been considering was a Senegal because they fit that size category where it could be kind of a 50-50 shot. However, when you dig deeper into it, a lot of people who have owned Senegals for a period of time were saying that their Senegals would start out quite social with other birds, and then as the birds got older, they became less and less tolerant of other birds in their presence. And that is not ideal. I do want this bird to be able to be a partner for Newt. That is my main goal. If it doesn't work out, obviously I will do my best to house them in their separate bird room, and I have the means to do that. But my main priority is being able to improve Newt's mental health with the loss of Mia. So that kind of knocked Senegal off the list pretty quick, since they did have a tendency to become a little bit more aggressive towards alternative species as they got older. Quakers, on the other hand, seem to have a tendency to socialize pretty well with a variety of other birds for a long period of time. The species as a whole tends to be very sociable and friendly, and Toto, already having previous experience with a conure, tends to lean him more in that direction. And now that isn't all to say that Toto is 100% going to be a perfect match. Quakers have a lot of very unique and different body language cues that differ from a maroon-bellied conure. One of the most distinct ones we've already noticed presenting a little bit of communication problems is Toto tends to use rubbing his beak on a surface as a way to diffuse tension, whereas for Newt, rubbing his beak on a surface is a means to cause a little bit of conflict and set a boundary. So it causes some issues and needs a little bit of training for them to both understand what each bird is meaning in those situations. Because in those situations, if Newt is trying to advocate for his space and Toto is trying to diffuse the tension by rubbing his beak on the ground, Newt might accidentally misinterpret that situation and think that Toto is trying to cause more conflict. And that's going to cause a lot of problems and potentially break out into a huge fight. So there is going to be quite a little bit of work for us to teach both birds what each of their body language means and how to safely navigate those interactions and teach them safer ways to communicate. Now, there were some elements of my individual preferences that came into play as well. When it comes to bringing a new bird into this home, I don't exclusively want to pick one that's going to work with Newt and then have me end up resenting or hating this bird because it's just a species that I don't get along with. So although my main priority is Newt, I do need to make sure that I am also going to love and interact with this bird just as much as I would Newt in the first place. So for me personally, that knocked kind of budgies and cockatiels out of the list. I just don't personally get along with those species very well. I just don't love their mannerisms as much as I do other birds. They're just not the species for me personally. I love interacting them with short bursts of time, but it's not a bird that I want to live with 24/7. Just my personal preference. Absolutely no hate to budgies and cockatiels. Absolutely no hate to them. They are very adorable. I do love them. Just not in my house all the time. And the last thing on my list to really consider is the sex of the bird. Some species of bird and some individuals of bird do have preferences when it comes to male or female parrots that they are interacting with, and it can also create a lot of problems. Since Newt is already a male bird, if I was bringing a female conure into the group, I could run into a lot of hormonal aggression problems where maybe those two birds would get along, but then Newt and the other bird may end up becoming quite aggressive to me if things aren't managed very carefully. For personal reasons, I also just try to avoid female birds now because I lost Zeeb to her trying to lay a giant egg, and it's just not something I really want to go through again. So I was primarily looking for a male bird, mostly for personal reasons, but also just to reduce those hormonal influences that could cause birds to want to fight. Male birds, depending on the species, tend to have a bit better of a time getting along than a bunch of females, but it is very dependent on the situation. And those are kind of the main things that I considered when it comes to bringing a new bird into the home. There are a lot of variables when it comes to bringing a new bird in, and it isn't just as simple as having one conure and adding in another conure and they're just going to mesh. Even if they're a super social species, there are a lot of minute details and things that can go wrong. So it is a little bit more complicated than it can be. And so we need to make sure that we are actually analyzing all the individual aspects of the birds at play here to hopefully set them up for success. And so that ended up landing us with Toto being the most viable option for a successful friendship with Newt. And so far, it's been about only 1 week of integration with them so far today. We've had Toto for a month at the point of recording this. He got his vet clearance and everything, and he's doing great. So we've done about 1 week of training with him and Newt together, and they're both already showing a lot of promise. Newt has already tried to preen him. Toto is obsessed with trying to socialize with him, but they're still just a little bit insecure with each other and needing a little bit of human intervention to help them facilitate healthy interactions. Which basically just means we're making sure that they both understand each other's body language, and what can happen a lot of the time is when both birds are actually so excited to interact with each other, they're kind of ignoring the fact that they are uncomfortable and not fully confident with the new bird, and so they'll squish together to get really comfy cozy, and then suddenly realize how scared they really are, and then feel stuck, and that's when fights can break out. So it's just taking a little bit of time to help them both kind of slow down and actually acknowledge how they're feeling, process those emotions, and make sure that they are fully confident before going ahead and interacting. But so far they're doing pretty good, so we are very hopeful that they are going to get along pretty well as the future sessions go. But that'll do it for the main things that I considered when it came to picking a new bird to join the existing flock. I hope that answered some of the questions that you guys had. If you have any more, feel free to ask them down below, and I will get to them as soon as I can. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye! Can we please move off my arm? My arm's getting so tired.